What's good, everybody? Last video, we cut it a little bit short just so we can save the juicy stuff all for this video because it's a lot to take in. So this video, we're going to be covering or starting to cover the app router in Next.js 15. So what is the app router? In version 13 of Next.js, they introduced a new router called the app router, which is built on React server components. React server components are components that can run on the server, and that is a whole nother can of worms that we can discuss in another separate video where we talk about client components and server components. We're going to be going over a lot of this stuff as we code as well, but I'll save that information for a separate video. All right, so before we start coding, because coding would definitely help all of this make sense, let's just talk about it for a second just so we can get our brains working. So creating routes. How does routing work in Next.js? So Next.js uses a file system-based router where folders are used to define your routes, aka your pages in your website. Each folder represents a route segment that maps to a URL segment. To create a nested route, you can nest these folders inside of each other. So what does this mean? I'm a visual learner, so the picture right here really helps me understand things. So let's start with our root. So we have acme.com/. So this root slash is where our app router begins. So that's literally where we're starting at. And we want to make a new page within this root. So we're going to define a new directory or a new folder inside of our app folder called dashboard. That gives us a new page called dashboard. If we define it accordingly, we'll talk about that later on. And we want to nest something inside of dashboard, we will make a new folder called settings. So this is how the file-based system works in Next.js when it comes to defining the routing for your pages in your application. Well, after hearing all that, you're probably saying to yourself, well, dang, Cam, so every directory that I make inside of this app router is publicly accessible? Nope, not at all. So that was just to get you the understanding or have you understand how your routing would work, like for defining new pages within your application. So to actually make this folder publicly accessible, by publicly accessible, I mean like a user can go into the URL and type in acme.com/dashboard. You need to define a page file. So what does this page file look like? Well, in our case, we're using TypeScript. So instead of page.js, it'll be page.tsx. So in our actual code, you can see here in our app root, so we don't have any folders or any routes defined. We just have the root URL. So you can see here we have a layout and a page file. You can see here we've named it home. We can name it whatever. We can just name it page if we want to. But you can see here, this is our page file. So without this page, it wouldn't be accessible. So let's go ahead for an example. Let's go ahead and dive into a coding example just so we can really get an understanding of how this works. Go ahead and make your local app. Go ahead and start running that. So if you don't remember how to do that, we discussed that in the first video, but we can also do it again here. So quickly, either go into your package.json and click the play button for dev if your editor allows that. But if it doesn't, you're simply going to go into your terminal and type in npm run dev. This will run your dev command, which starts up your app locally. So once your app starts up, you should be able to access your app from localhost 3000. Notice that we don't have any routes defined yet, so you can literally just type in localhost 3000 and the app root URL would show. So which is just the slash thing that we talked about from our documents earlier. So to really make sure this sticks about having publicly accessible routes, let's go ahead and change our page.tsx file. Remember, we need this to make our routes publicly accessible. But let's say if we rename it so it technically doesn't exist, what happens to our page? So you saw earlier that our local host was running successfully. You saw the home page, the default home page that Next.js gives you. So if we rename this to .old, what happens? So you can see here, we get a 404 saying that this page cannot be found. Well, why is that? Well, like the doc said, if you don't have a page.tsx file, your route is no longer accessible. So this is a good example of how everything works with your routing. So just because you have a directory defined in your app router, it doesn't make it publicly accessible. So that moves us into another topic of colocation, or how files or your code or your components can live beside each other in the app router. So let's talk about that. All right. So now that we have a decent understanding of how defining routes work, let's talk about colocation. So like we talked about in the last segment, you see what I did there? Route segment. All right, bet. All right. So Even though we defined a new directory inside of our app router, it doesn't make that directory publicly accessible until we have a page.tsx or a route.tsx. Don't worry about route.tsx yet because we're not even talking about that. But if you don't have one of these to define inside of your directories, it will not be publicly accessible or routable, as they say here in this image. So when you make the route publicly accessible, you have to have the page.tsx or the route.tsx file added within that directory. So you can see here in the picture, /dashboard becomes routable when we add the page file. Same thing for settings and same thing for your API. This means that your project files can be safely co-located inside the route segments in the app directory without someone, accidentally typing in your route and going to like your actual component component. So for example, if you have a components directory inside of your app, it's not routable because you don't have a page file. So your button.js or tsx file can live in there safely. Same thing for the lib directory. Same thing for dashboard. So inside of our actual route dashboard, we have our page file. That's the only thing that's routable. If somebody tries to navigate to our nav.js file, they won't be able to because that's just not how things work. So you can have your code files safely stored within the app directory itself for that particular route if you want to. But typically, I don't set up my code like that. I use more of a private folder approach, like they say here. We'll talk about this when we actually start coding out our example, but I typically follow the private folder strategy where I mark all of my directories with an underscore just to keep things, a little bit clearer, helps me understand a little bit better how things are organized, and I keep my components separate from the pages and the routes. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about route groups. Again, all of these topics we're going to cover when we actually start coding our practice project, but for now we're just trying to get like a gist of it. We don't need a full understanding, but we just need to get it like into our brains. Let's plant that seed, So route groups can be created by wrapping your route or your directory with a folder in parentheses. So for example, this indicates the folders for organizational purposes and should not be included in the route's URL path. So for example, we have our dashboard directory that we've talked about earlier. We decide to wrap that into an admin only route or route group. So we put admin and we wrap that in parentheses. So if a user tries to, or if we try to do it ourselves and access that in the URL, it won't work because that's literally like an invisible folder. It's just really used for organizational purposes. And you can actually add different layouts and whatnot. We'll talk about that later as well. But it's really helpful for organizational purposes. I know I use that in some actual production sites at my job just to keep things organized, but that's the main purpose behind it. So you can see here, you have admin. So if you don't want to define an admin route, you can just have a route group that's hidden from the URL, but in the code, you actually see it. It'll show up as admin. And they have it separated here by marketing. So anything with marketing related things, you can have about, blog. It doesn't add that extra layer on top of the route that you have defined. So it won't be a /admin or a /marketing. You will just still be able to access the pages as, normal like they do here. So /about, /blog, /dashboard. All right. So before we start coding, one of the last files I want to talk about while we're getting the gist of the app router is our layout file. So if we go into our code, you can see along with our page file in our root, we have a layout.tsx. And while we're here, let's go ahead and revert that change that we did earlier where we renamed that file. So let's put the page.tsx file back to how it was, remove the .old that we did. And let's just verify. You can see our app is now back working. So, all right, so let's get back into it. So layout, the layout file is used to define the layout in your Next.js application. So the root layout is the topmost layout in the root app directory. It is required and it's used to define the HTML and body tags and other globally shared UI. So you can see here in our code, we have our root layout defined, and you can see here it has the HTML and the body tag along with some fonts that are already pre-installed when we create our app. So this root layout is required. Layouts for other pages are optional. You would typically only add a layout if you want to have like literally a different layout on each of your pages. So for example, if we wanted to add like a header like this, only on some pages, we can have a layout. This is where we can add a route group for only specific routes to have that layout. So that, again, that's another advanced topic we'll talk about later. But if you wanted to have like a global header, for example, you can add that to either this layout, or you can make a nested layout for like your dashboard page only, and you want that header there. So it's a lot of different ways you can do it. But the root layout is required, and the other layout files will be like a wrapper around the pages. All right. So for example, like I was saying, you can have nested layout. So remember, the root layout that's in the top layer of your app directory, that's required, but other layouts are not. So if you want to go ahead and start having like specific layouts for each of your pages, that root layout will wrap that other layout. So let me give you an example. So for example, we have our root layout here, and on our dashboard page, let's say we wanted to have another layout, you would put that inside of the dashboard directory, and this is what it would look like. So you would have the root layout wrapping that, and then this is what the new layout would look like. So it's kind of distinct. The root layout would be the wrapper, and then anything else under it will be inside of that. So I know it's kind of hard as I'm explaining it, but once we start coding, you'll get it. It'll really start to click for you. Again, I just wanted to get like your brains working and like get a good gist of it before we even start getting into the code. We're about to do a little bit of coding. We'll do a lot more coding in later videos, but we're going to do a little bit. So to start, let's go ahead and modify our root page component to just have a hello world instead of all of that Next.js default stuff, that gibberish that we don't really care about. So we're going to go ahead and go either from the docs, or you can manually type this in. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go into my code editor, and we're just going to literally copy, remove everything from this page.tsx file, and just paste what we copied just so we can see. So instead of home page, we'll just say hello root page. And now we would expect our UI to update because we haven't stopped running our command yet. So by editing, we should get like a live update. So you can see here, we now have hello root page. Again, it's going to be ugly. We're not adding styling right now, but we're just trying to get our minds wrapped around how things work. Remember, if you guys want to follow along as we slowly increment and like just get more advanced with our code, the repo link is in the video description. And once you clone down the repo to your machine, each video will have a different branch that we're modifying the code on, just so you can see as things grow and where we started from. So in this case, the branch name would be router basics. So once you copy it down to your machine, make sure you're on the router basics branch, and then you should see all the changes we made today. So we're not done just yet though. So for our last example, let's go ahead and actually define a new page. And like we talked about in the last video, for the sake of learning, let's go ahead. We're going to set up start setting up our fake blog. So the page that we want to create, we'll go ahead, since we already have our root or our home page, we'll leave that be. We're going to make a post page. So this page will list out all posts on our website. So we'll go into our app directory, remember, and make a new directory or a folder called posts. So by default, remember, this will not be accessible publicly until we place that page file in here. So we'll go ahead and copy this in and put this inside of our posts directory. So we'll make a new page.tsx. And then we'll go ahead and put this in here, and then we'll say hello posts page this time. And then we'll delete that comment because that's no longer needed. And here we are. So now if we go back to our app, remember we haven't stopped running the command. And if you did, just simply type in npm run dev in your terminal, and you go back to your localhost app. And now if we go to /posts, I was already working on a separate blog site for the coding channel, but that's a separate story. And you'll see here, hello post page has rendered successfully. So we've successfully created our new page with the app router. So hopefully this video has broken things down a little bit. Again, the more we code, the more things will start to click. But hopefully it's just giving you just like like I understand, the aha moment. So hopefully it's helped a little bit. If it hasn't, or if I've like missed the ball completely, let me know, and I'll try to re-explain things for you guys. But I try to do it the way I learn to. I learn visually and learn by doing. So hopefully just by talking about it first and then doing it, this has helped you like just get like a gist of it. Remember, we've barely scratched the surface of Next.js, but hopefully you get like you're starting to get a gist of how things work with the app router from this video. again, we're going to get more and more in depth as we go along. But as always, I appreciate y'all watching. More content coming consistently. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. And yeah, until next time.